My husband, Mark, had been plugging away at an entry-level job when he got recruited to a place that tripled his salary overnight. One day we were splitting ramen and talking about paying off student loans in a decade. The next day he was holding an offer letter that looked like a promise. We were newly married, still figuring out how to alphabetize our spice rack without making it a marital meeting, and suddenly we had a plan that felt blindingly simple. Live on my income, save everything Mark earned, and buy a house in a year. It was austerity with a golden lining. We ate leftovers with ceremony. Mark downloaded spreadsheets like they were sacred texts. We talked like economists who had discovered love, serious, slightly giddy, utterly convinced of our prudence. That's how we found the 2-bedroom condo for $950 a month. It was the size of a postage stamp that thought it was a grown-up apartment. Sunny living room, crooked blinds, a kitchen that required choreography to open both cupboards at once. It had the sort of quirks that read as character when you're poor, and as minor inconveniences when your bank account suddenly smells like possibility. The owner was Paul Vincent. Paul had the face of a man who has spent too long in fluorescent-lit trusteeship. Thin, pinched, a permanent crease between his eyebrows where empathy might have been. He wore tasteful suits and had the smile of someone who had practiced not caring. He talked like a man who graded people on their timeliness and their ability to obey rules without asking why. One of his leading lines, delivered as if reciting an item from scripture, was that he would never be responsible for the garbage disposal. Not in the lease, not his problem. Don't even think about asking. There was a strange pride in that disclaimer, like he was shielding some sacred relic from the unwashed masses. And then there was the way he looked at Mark's salary on the application. I can still see him leaning in, eyes squinting as if peering into a new world, and muttering, "I can't believe how much software developers make." He said it the way you say something when you don't know whether to congratulate someone or resent them for their luck. He said it 6 times at least. He repeated it like a mantra. You could feel the judgment in every syllable, as if our competence, and therefore our worthiness for fair treatment, had been put on trial. We were, in Paul's mind, 2 kids making too much money for our own good. That inference felt cheap and ugly, like we'd been cast as villains for having succeeded. But we signed the lease. We paid on time. We were tidy, quiet renters who stacked our boxes in neat labeled columns and left little notes for the neighbors thanking them in advance for tolerating moving day chaos. We kept our heads down and our savings accounts fat. A year blurred by in the way adult time does when you're counting zeros. Work, dinners, spreadsheets, late-night calls with mortgage brokers. Our house, a small, sensible thing with a porch and a yard that smelled like possibility, was almost ready. We called Paul before our lease expired and asked the reasonable favor we had been promised. Could we extend month to month for 2 months while final repairs finished and the movers were scheduled? He said it would be fine. He said the words people say when they're not yet ready to reveal themselves. Then the lease extension came. We had expected a form, maybe a quick signature, and a thumbs up. What we opened was a paper that looked like a joke you weren't supposed to laugh at. The rent had jumped from $950 to $450. Not a rounding error, not a market adjustment. A 50% increase like a slap delivered in a clerical font. Mark called him. I remember the sound of the phone from the kitchen, his voice first disbelief, then an almost childish hope that the man on the other end would see reason. Paul was unyielding, measured like a man reading from a manual of justifications. "It's what the apartment goes for now," he told Mark, with a tone that suggested this information was elemental and immutable. I'd be losing money renting it for less. He folded the math into moral certainty, as people do when they're trying to make greed sound reasonable. And then he said it. The line that lodged in my chest like a rusted nail and stayed there. You don't have to like it. You just have to pay it. I want to be clear about how small the cruelty of that sentence was and how large its echo became. It was not a shout. It was not cinematic. It was a bureaucrat's sentence, precise, antiseptic, and designed to remove the conversation from the realm of negotiation into the quiet doom of inevitability. It was a moral shrug. It was, in other words, textbook Paul. We tried to rearrange our lives around it. For 2 nights, we schemed like fugitives. Could we rent a storage unit and crash on friend couches? Could we stagger our moves? Could we find a cheaper sublet? None of it worked. The mortgage closing dates, the contractor delays, the rent calendar, everything conspired to keep our bodies in that apartment for those 2 extra months. Envelopes of savings trembling in the other room like restrained animals. So we paid. We wrote the checks that felt like apologies to someone who had no business taking them. When we finally moved out, boxes taped, counters scrubbed until they reflected the ceiling like mint glass, we left that place the way you would leave a relationship, with neat notes and no flames, and a small, private vow not to let the memory linger. We expected, reasonably, to get our deposit back. Instead, Paul deducted $300 for cleaning and other vague charges. $100 for a cleaning fee we thought reasonable, $300 for the kind of petty accounting that smells like opportunism. $500 here, $300 there. Numbers that on paper read like administrative adjustments, but in reality looked like a slow thumb being run across the scales of fairness until the numbers slid away. Between the extra months and the withheld deposit, Paul had managed to extract about $1,200 that we had not budgeted for and had no right to collect. If it had been a loan, logical transaction, market forces and all that, I could have swallowed it as life's small bruise. But what made it worse was the theater of greed that followed. Weeks after we left, I saw the apartment ad in the paper, listed at only $150 more than what we were originally paying. A month went by, and the same ad, another month and a $75 bump. It didn't make sense from any market perspective. It made perfect sense from a pettiness perspective. He had tried to squeeze money out of people who had no choice and failed to even maintain the sham long enough to reap his benefit. He'd yelled at us for being a good risk on paper and then tried to punish us for living like adults. I kept replaying his phrase in my head, the easy cruelty of it. You don't have to like it. You just have to pay it. It became a talisman of everything I found loathsome about people who confuse rules with morality. It wasn't dramatic or violent. It was the subtle thing that fits into the fabric of a life and ruins the texture. It was the moment I learned that sometimes justice is not immediate, and sometimes indignation has to be carried around like a pebble in your shoe until it wears a groove in your patience. So I tucked that pebble away. I went on with the spreadsheets and the paint colors and the boxes labeled kitchen essentials in careful handwriting. But beneath the ordinary life we resumed, the porch, the small, predictable joys, Paul's sentence sat like a splinter under my skin. It would have to be pulled out cleanly someday, or else it would fester. 5 years had a way of sanding edges down until history felt like a story you could tell without the sting. We had a house that smelled like new paint and coffee, a steady rhythm to weekdays, and a little person, our baby, who turned every plan into something softer and messier. Paul's face lived in the back of my head like a cartoon villain you only remembered when you saw his silhouette on a cereal box. The outrage had cooled to a useful memory. A lesson about ledger lines and petty men. Then, one ordinary Thursday, the past walked through the front door of my husband's office like it owned the place. I was there with Mark for some reason. He'd asked me to drop off a lunch he'd forgotten, or maybe he just wanted me to see the conference room because we were picking paint colors that night, and he liked to talk through decisions out loud. I heard Phil at reception, light and joking the way he always was, saying he expected someone to drop off paperwork. The name he used made my stomach do a weird little flip. Paul Vincent. Time does funny things. In that small office, the flip felt like thunder. My hand tightened around the paper bag like it had something to do with courage. Same name, same real estate agent. It meant nothing, until it meant everything. Paul walked in like a man who hadn't time for small talk. The suit he wore had the precise, neat quality of someone who never spilled coffee and therefore never learned humility. He carried a thin folder of papers and that exact look of somebody who believed paperwork was the natural order of things. He didn't notice me. He didn't notice anyone at first. He was all business, greeting Phil with the practiced warmth of a man whose office had taught him how to smile without committing. Phil introduced us in that breezy way he had. "Hey, Paul, this is Mark." "Mark, Paul." I stepped forward because that's what you do when a memory comes knocking. Mark said my name, Christina, like he was setting the scene for a story. "Paul, this is my wife, Christina. We rented from you years ago on, you remember, the 2-bedroom on Elm?" The pause afterward was a small, surgical thing. I could see the recognition come like a light being switched on in Paul's eyes. His polite smile faltered for the first time. In that moment, when the paper-thin veneer of his courtesy cracked, the world felt astonishingly small and perfect. I watched him carefully, like a scientist observing a specimen. He remembered. Mark's tone stayed casual, the kind of casual that sharpens into something colder, the sound of a man who has practiced telling the truth so often it lands like a fact. He mentioned, offhand, the math you want to tuck into your brain when thinking of commissions. Selling a condo for a couple $100,000, buying a house for $500,000, agents cut on both sides, ballpark, maybe 20 grand. The statement was made like a harmless observation, the sort of thing you say to calculate whether a contractor has been honest with you. The silence that followed stretched deliciously. I saw Paul's posture shift. That neat, guarded face turned just slightly redder. For the first time since he told us that garbage disposals weren't his problem, he looked small. Phil was blinking, surprised at the sudden odd weight of the conversation. I probably would have sat quietly if Mark hadn't felt the need to lean in. Less aggression than illustration. He told the story. The rent hike, the withheld deposit, the exact wording that had lodged in our heads, the bureaucratic cruelty of, you don't have to like it, you just have to pay it. He said it without theatrics, which made it sharper. Paul smiled a thin smile that had nothing behind it. Did that reflexive shuffle people do when they want to move past something uncomfortable. He said it was complicated, tried to steer Phil back to the paperwork. He was an agent. Staying on script was his comfort. He wrapped up the meeting, tucked the folder back under his arm, shook hands in the way people shake when they want to be unremarkable, and left. The door hadn't even closed before Mark turned to Phil and said, "Don't sign anything yet. I've got a story for you." He told Phil the whole stupid, infuriating saga. Every check we'd written, the $500 gouge, the $300 of deposit he'd kept for cleaning. Phil's jaw tightened in a way that made me like him more than I already did. I could see the wheels turning in his head. He was a decent man, annoyed at injustice, and apparently he had no appetite for helping a petty man get rich on the backs of people who had been honest. Phil paused. For a second, he looked both sympathetic and giddy, like someone who had stumbled onto a plot twist in the novels he loved. "What do you want me to say when I fire him?" he asked, half grinning, half deadly serious. We plotted like suburban conspirators. It was deliciously petty and also exquisitely fair. Mark handed Phil little lines he could use, truth wrapped in the dryness of an office conversation. The plan wasn't complicated. Phil would fire Paul as his agent, politely but irrevocably. The payoff wasn't punishment so much as professional consequence. Paul would lose the commission he expected to collect from both the sale and purchase. 20 grand would evaporate from his future ledger because of a single well-timed call. The next day, I stood in the hallway just behind Phil like stage lighting. It felt theatrical, but we had earned a small theatricality. I wanted to see the moment he learned how it felt to stand on the wrong side of his own sentence. Phil dialed. I heard the cadence of the conversation through a doorway. "Hi, Paul. It's Phil. About the condo. Yeah, I've been thinking it over. I've decided to go with another agent." There was a polite pause and then the chorus of professional objections that one expects in such calls. No, you shouldn't give a discount. You'd be losing money if you did that." Then Phil, with the slow, quiet cruelty of someone delivering exactly what was deserved, said, "No, it has nothing to do with Christina's husband. But, Paul, you don't have to like it. You just have to accept it." Click. Hanging up felt comic and holy at once. There's a kind of justice that doesn't roar. It simply closes the door on someone's plan. Watching Phil put down the phone, I felt something dissolve. Years of that small, persistent bitterness. I imagined the invisible math in Paul's head unspooling, the commissions evaporating, the easy income he'd been expecting curtailed. For 5 years, he had enjoyed the smugness of bureaucracy. For 5 minutes, the same bureaucracy was used against him. There was no shouting, no trapdoor, no dramatic confrontation. The revenge was administration, the slow and satisfying kind, bureaucratic karma. It was the kind of resolution that doesn't taste like vindictiveness so much as balance. Paul had once used the power of a signature and a clause to make a small family pay. Now, by an ordinary set of choices, by a friend refusing to be complicit, that power flipped back. Later, over bad takeout and a toddler who thought nap time was negotiable, Mark and I laughed about how neat it was that the universe had a sense of humor. I felt lighter in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't triumph so much as relief, like finally taking out a splinter that had been there long enough to be foolish. Life kept moving. Bills, baby spit up, the tiny, boring tasks that make a home feel owned. Sometimes when I pass a realtor's sign or flip through a classified, I catch my breath and remember the exact tone of Paul's sentence. It doesn't have the power to wound anymore. It's just a reminder. The world is often petty and unfair, but it's also threaded with people who will refuse to enable that pettiness. That's the kind of neighborhood I like living in, not loud, not theatrical, just where quiet, decent people refuse to be taken advantage of. If King of the Hill ever taught me anything, it was that the moral resolution is rarely a sermon. It's a neighbor fixing a fence and then returning your lawnmower because he knows what's right. We didn't need spectacle. We needed the small, stubborn return of balance. And sometimes that's all revenge should be. The ledger set straight, the splinter gone, and the porch light left on for the next person.